The first thing I noticed was the living room walls. There were two people sitting and drinking wine. A woman and a man. There was a place for a woman, but not for a man. The man who belonged there was absent. This man was larger, rougher, and his voice was low and full of a web of seduction. The spell was unwinding in the silent weariness of the living room. The woman looked modest, hiding her duplicity behind ostentatious modesty. Their conversation was full of intrigue. Both sides played it well, and it was sort of funny. It was like a high school romance, where you can't tell if they're serious or not, or like an 18th century farce, where wits and sophistication joke around while they hurt each other. Their first kiss was shy, short, and not very passionate. The next one was full of passion. In the tongue wrestling match, he pulled her into his arms while the mantelpiece looked on. A sudden gust of wind blew through the house, making the old logs on the floor begin to shake. The floor above creaked alarmingly. The two lovers looked up. He became worried, asking if anyone was home. She replied timidly, "John is in France." She knew that this old house just creaked. "Sometimes I think the house is haunted if I believe in that kind of thing." He gave a shrug. "It's a wonderful old place. How did you get it?" "J.N. inherited it from his great-aunt. It's really worth millions. The grounds are gorgeous and have recently been refurbished." "Forget it. You were telling me something." He pulled her into his arms again and whispered in her ear. His words were too quiet to be heard even in the house was silent. There was a tangible tension in the air, and the fire in the fireplace crackled, using up its allotted fuel and spitting out sparks from time to time. The woman giggled, and they kissed again. Cupid, the blind god of love, watched them with silent disapproval as the man unzipped her dress. Cupid's usually angelic face seemed to frown menacingly in the firelight. Large hands slid once inside. It was clear she wasn't wearing a bra. Her husband had bought her a dress for her birthday, but she'd never worn it. It had slipped down to her waist. Her breasts were impressive, not so much in size as in shape, firmness, and high position. They seemed larger as they moved forward. Fire had invaded a small drop of the oil that had been in the wood for a long time burst, causing a small explosion. This made the guilty couple flinch, but they quickly forgot about it as his thumb stroked the small nub, drawing a moan from her lips. The eyes of the moose head mounted above the fireplace glared angrily at the intruder. The man paused his relentless seduction for a moment as if sensing their gaze, then quickly focused on his prey. He'd been working on this for several months. The fruits of his labor were before his eyes. The gorgeous young wife of his boss, John Hayward, was finally standing topless before him. He was going to have fun with her tonight on the family bed. He'd been neglecting, ignoring, and refusing her promotions, but tonight he'd finally get his reward, the body of this beautiful stranger's wife. He deepened their kiss, slowly leaning her back, until her head was on the pillow and she was lying on her back beneath him. The springs of the old sofa protested against such a load, but the couple didn't pay attention to it. The man's lips drew a fiery line down the white neck of the beautiful young wife, causing a shiver in her fragile body. The sensations overwhelmed her, and she moaned softly, tangling her fingers in his hair to bring his teasing lips closer. She gasped as his lips found her sensitive spots again, and the sound went unnoticed by the eavesdropping walls. Her lover caressed her breasts, giving them all his attention. The young wife was consumed by the sensation and could hardly contain her excitement. The fire consumed her breasts and scattered sparks across her flat stomach. It paused to plunge a dagger of pleasure into her tiny navel. He teased that delicious curve for a moment before moving down to her dress, which was gathered into a knot at the waist. Her fingers pulled, and she lifted her hips. As the dress slid down, another gust of wind blew through the house. The stairs creaked loudly, but the couple on the sofa didn't notice. Kisses rained down on her smooth, silky skin, and the young wife's moans grew louder. Passion filled the air as he made his way through the necessary skillful movements. His skillful play brought her close to the edge, to the opening abyss of pleasure. But he wanted more. "Let's get comfortable. Where's your bedroom?" he whispered. She moaned. He wrapped the slender body in his strong embrace, and the walls shook. Another gust of wind carried her easily towards the stairs. She trembled from the strength of the arms holding her. He was filled with anticipation for his inevitable triumph. The steps creaked in protest as he stepped on them with his bare feet. His ankle twisted slightly due to a fold in the rug. He straightened up and continued up the stairs, which were getting darker. The 13th step of an ancient staircase gave a little, and one of the old nails came free, exposing its sharp tip. The man carried his prize upstairs, and the house held its breath. Another gust of wind caused a symphony of creaks and groans from the ancient beams. The man's bare foot landed on the 13th step, and he screamed as sparks flashed in his eyes, and a pinprick of pain shot through his heel. He staggered, trying to regain his balance as the symphony of creaking wood rose to a crescendo. Then, with a hoarse cry, he tumbled down the stairs, clutching his burden. He was barely aware of the danger looming over them. He fell backwards, hitting his head on the edge of the step. Darkness swallowed him up. She cried out too as they slid together towards their fate. Their slide became a somersault, flesh, and the bone was giving way to the skeletal hardness of old wood, so he remained at the foot of the stairs. His head was awkwardly tilted, indicating that there was no hope of his survival. His companion hit the last baluster with a terrible crash, breaking her arm and several ribs. She opened her mouth in pain. Her eyes filled with horror as she saw the Cupid statue fall from the broken baluster. The tip of Cupid's arrow, which bore the weight of the marble statue, pierced her left breast and pinned her to the floor. Her body shook, and her sightless eyes stared at the high tin ceiling. The wind sighed in the eaves, the fire crackled and died slowly, and its heartbeat faded. As the fuel ran out, the house fell silent. It was waiting for the owner to return. Revenge incarnate had completed its task. Sylvia's moan was muffled by the pillow covering her face. She had a very erotic dream. This was repeated, and the brightness consumed her. She felt pleasure, and the old house also fell into slumber. The creaking of logs was heard, long established, but disturbed by some kind of disturbance below. A few smoldering coals were reminiscent of fire and sensual scenes. John laid his beautiful wife down on the soft, fluffy carpet again and again, trying to get enough of her love to last him for the next 9 days. Sylvia was an extremely sensual woman, and he wanted her to remember to be filled with the glow of his love. They felt like more than just husband and wife. They were connected on a spiritual and romantic level. This was something he'd never experienced with anyone, even with the deceiver, whom he found lying at the foot of the stairs. Sylvia did remember, and in the evening she lit that fire again to remind herself of the man who filled her head, heart, and body with his love. She had a glass of wine with dinner and another in the chair. She pulled up next to the fireplace, put an ottoman in front of the chair and, with her feet up, sipped a dark Cabernet. Her dogs stomped across the floor and dropped down next to her, groaning, their claws clicking on the wooden floor. She dozed off and felt that the atmosphere had become very tense. She opened her eyes and looked around the room. Everything was okay. The walls were fixed. The blind gaze reassured her with their strength. The elk's head hanging over the fireplace seemed to be looking at her approvingly, so she relaxed, closed her eyes, and fell back into slumber. Her thoughts were lost in a wine-dark sea of satisfaction, returning to the scene that had played out the night before. She felt a pleasant wave of memory, remembering John's lips and how he showered her breasts with his caresses. She had great, firm breasts. She felt the tickling of her long black curls falling into the cleavage, revealed by the 3 buttons of her blouse that she had left undone. The dark creaminess of this curve welcomed the caress. She could almost feel the fiery lips pulling aside the curls of silky hair and leaving a hot trail. Her mind became absorbed in the vision of touch and sensation. It seemed to her that she was naked. Light fingers playing along the satin of her skin, her husband's touches preparing her for pleasure. Desire overpowered all conscious thoughts as she gave into her pleasure and exploded in the white light of pure passion. Her cries echoed through the empty house until she fell exhausted, her mind empty. The fire that had been crackling busily consumed its allotted fuel, spreading its warmth into the cold night air, died down its flames. The fire died down until it was just an orange glow filling the room with comfort. The dogs raised their heads, alarmed by the screams, but having calmed down, returned to their places. Sylvia stirred her thoughts and began to spin them instinctively. Her fingers slid down her body, and later she relaxed. It was a dream. Cupid smiled benevolently at her from his place on the balustrade, holding his arrow at the ready, as she floated in the glow of her sleep, lying in her large bed. She felt sleep take over again. The morning sun barely broke through the lace panels on the window, and the boudoir was cozy and softly glowing. She stirred as the sensations from last night returned. It was John, his weight on her, and she could feel his belly pressing against the curve of her ass. Sylvia knew that men liked to look at her ass. It was one of those round, bouncy things that starlets gravitated towards. She'd worked hard to keep it that way. Now she felt how her husband was enjoying her, just as she was enjoying him. A light breeze blew through the open window, parting the lace, and the beautiful morning sun looked down on the beautiful sleeping woman. She sank into oblivion and dozed off an hour later. She got up on a light sundress and went downstairs for breakfast. Her thoughts were in disarray. Strange dreams bothered her. She'd had erotic dreams before, but never anything like this. In fact, she'd never had dreams like this before. They felt very real, like they were happening to her. There was just something about the atmosphere that seemed alive. She couldn't quite put her finger on what it was, but she always felt like there was something there just beyond the senses. On the edge of her vision, she first felt a little scared. Now, it just seemed somewhat calming, as though a kind angel was watching over her. She and John met in New York, and she quickly fell in love with his charm, soft Southern accent, and easy manner. It didn't hurt that he had just taken over the department that most often affected her interests. They began dating, and by the time he had completed a major department overhaul, she knew he told her about his home. And she imagined some kind of southern homestead overlooking acres of cotton fields. After 2 weeks without him, she felt very lonely, so she was happy to accept his invitation to come and spend a week at his house. The house was exactly as she had imagined it, except that instead of cotton fields, the tall windows looked out onto gardens filled with butterflies and hummingbirds fluttering among them. The garden was immaculately kept, with flower beds and majestic live oaks draped in Spanish moss lining the driveway. Magnolias lined the entrance too. They'd been married for 2 months, but this was the first time John had to leave. She knew she'd miss him, but the thought of his return, and the joy that would fill their hearts, made her look forward to and dream of a reunion. The old clock in the hallway chimed, showing it was already 11. At 11 she went out into the back garden and sat on the swing on the covered veranda. The dogs followed her. The swing seemed to move on its own as she sipped her tea and breathed in the air saturated with jasmine and lavender. Nearby were huge animals, bull mastiffs, and gifts from JN. He knew that she longed for communication when he was not around. Did Mom's children find charming smells? She asked them as they circled around. They painted happily. She sat down on the grass and looked out at the bay windows. The house seemed pleased that its mistress was there. The oak logs were positioned comfortably, and the years had passed behind them. Memories walked, whispered, and creaked. The tree had once been a forest giant, wreathed in Spanish moss. It towered above the swampy terrain, and the slight elevation gave its view greater extension from time to time. People came and gathered at its foot. People gathered at the tree's base to perform their rituals. Sometimes they dug at the roots, burying their dead among beads, weapons, and offerings to the spirits. Over time, a village of small hills grew around the tree. The people changed, and the tree became their most powerful talisman. It became the repository of their fortunes. They offered prayers to its spirit, and the tree absorbed them. As the tree moved, so did the feelings and enchantment filling the area. Over time, the oak tree became aware of what was happening around it. Then the visitors stopped coming. They no longer came with sadness and prayers. Not everything was good in their world, so they were expelled. The tree was waiting. He had limitless patience. Many centuries passed, and he had many more centuries to wait, unless something happened, like a lightning strike or fire. Think about how, over time, new people came. They didn't express any thoughts. They weren't just visitors. They came to settle down. Their skin was pale, and their thoughts were about industry and agriculture. The forest was cleared, and the swamp was drained. Fields grew on the fertile soil, and the tree blessed them. They bore fruit in abundance, and the tree was satisfied. The final catastrophe has arrived. A fungus that attacks the roots of a fungus was slow and tiny. carried by bugs and crawling things through the soil. The oak's foliage was depleted, its vitality dried up. It was forced to conserve its vitality more and more in order to survive. The battle was lost. Ethan Thomas came to this cleared land, built a cabin, married his bride, raised children, and succeeded more than he could have imagined. The tree stood on his land. He admired it. The forest giant was saddened by his decline. He had been planning this for a long time. He would build his family their dream home using lumber from a dying tree. Before it begins to decay and rot, the tree was cut down and the huge logs were taken away on a wagon to be cut into planks and flooring. The house took shape, built on the very hill that the tree occupied. Ethan Thomas lived there for the rest of his life. The house passed to his son and subsequent generations. The spirit of the tree continued to live in the house. During wartime, the house watched over the Thomas family and took part in their fortunes. His current owner was among his favorites. He reminded the spirit of the dark times. Centuries ago, people were skinned around the oak tree. Her skin was a rich, creamy brown, while theirs had a different sheen. She was also in contact with the spirit world. She wore crystals on a gold chain around her neck. She placed them throughout the house, on mantelpieces, shelves, and in cases. She performed rituals that were strange to her husband, but he called them the whole house benefited from her presence. The lawns and gardens were vibrant and fragrant. In return, the house looked after her, indulging her sensuality, caring for her, and soothing her inner being. There were even snakes in Eden. In a nearby small town there lived a snake named Rodney Wilson because of his unfortunate start in life. Rodney Wilson was born into a rough neighborhood. He was a hard worker, but he didn't look for work beyond what he needed to survive: food, alcohol, and a rundown shack that he kept barely habitable. He used illegal substances, was arrested many times, and spent time in the county jail. He once went to prison for molesting a neighbor's daughter. He was cautious, but he was sexually hungry. He found out that Sylvia was living in this small community. He was sitting in the park when she walked by, taking her dogs for a walk. She amazed him and took his breath away. There weren't many people of color in the community, which was pretty remarkable. But her hair, her shiny curls, her exotic and mysterious face, and her firm body, demonstrated by her sports, all made a big impression on him. Top and shorts, the way her hips swayed, he was hypnotized. He often saw her in the city, and she followed him. Watching her became an obsession. He talked to her several times, and her friendly and open manner attracted him even more. He was also offended by the fact that in subsequent meetings, she never remembered him. After the hurricane, Rodney was at work cleaning. Up in the countryside, John and Sylvia, of course, hired workers to clean up their property. Rodney wasn't one of the men hired, but he was working on a neighbor's property and saw her in the yard. Her yellow sundress a splash of color against the green lawns. Once the work was done, Rodney had some money and bought the drug he needed, which should last him a while. He spent a few days there, staying with a small group of his friends at a river not far from where John and Sylvia lived. When the party ended, he got into his old truck and drove down the highway towards the city. As he drove by, he noticed that one light was on in John and Sylvia's house. He pulled his truck to the side of the road and stopped. He sat for a while, driven by hunger, but restrained by caution. Hunger won, and he crept along the path to the house. As unfamiliar feet stepped onto the driveway and towards the carefully manicured lawn, the reality of the intruder slowly began to form. The reflections from the pool sparkled menacingly, and the stranger felt a vague uneasiness overcome him. He thought about leaving, but the spot of light from that window flickered strangely, attracting him like a moth to a flame. Carefully looking inside, he saw the bathroom was big with a tiled floor, an address table with bottles of cosmetics on it, a candle burning on the dressing table and two more flickering on the edge of the huge bathtub. Sylvia was enjoying her bath. She left Jan in bed after turning him into a trembling wreck and filled the bath with bubbles. Rose entered and a stream flowed down the candle, filling the room with a scent she loved. She relaxed, taking a long soak. She had a glass of her favorite red wine and an empty bottle stood next to it. She soaked, finished off the wine, and let the silence of the house lull her into a slumber. The water began to cool and she stepped out of the bath, drying herself off with a large, fluffy towel. Rodney, standing outside the window, froze in his tracks. The naked beauty of this goddess was the subject of his dreams. He stood fascinated watching her as she finally wrapped a towel around herself, hiding her exposed beauty from prying eyes. She spent a lot of time taking out various bottles and jars, combing her hair with them until she had formed those shiny curls that framed her face in that familiar way. She blew out the 2 candles on the bathtub, collected her empty glass and bottle, and took the lit candle from the mantelpiece. She left the room. Rodney followed the flickering light through the house and finally reached the kitchen. Sylvia turned on the light over the sink and blew out the candle. She lazily rinsed the glass in the sink, put it in the dishwasher, and turned it on. The inrush current caused a failure in the safety system, and the alarm went off. Fluting the wall of the house with the light revealed the man lurking outside, and Sylvia saw the flash of light. She looked towards the window and saw Rodney's face in the kitchen light. She froze for a moment, shocked into immobility, and let out a quiet scream before running away. Rodney didn't waste any time in running away down the long driveway. Sylvia ran into the bedroom and shook her sleeping husband John awake. "Wake up," she said, shaking him again. She ran over to grab the robes and whispered, "Get up, let's see if they're still there." John got up, put on his robe, and followed her to the front door, stopping only to get a 12-gauge pistol from behind the bedroom door. "Are you sure, honey? Did you really see someone?" "Yes, there was a man there. I'll never forget his face. He seemed a little familiar to me, as if I'd seen him before." As they approached the door, Niles and Grant became alarmed at the alarm and joined their hosts. John opened the door, chambered a cartridge, and took aim. Niles and Grant ran out onto the porch, looking for the source of the noise. As they hurried through the magnolia trees at the end of the driveway, Sylvia saw a figure trying to hide with a roar. The dogs took off, chasing 2 huge figures down the driveway after the fleeing intruder. He glanced back over his shoulder, looking frightened, and started running even faster. John turned on the outside lights, flooding the driveway with light, and they watched the chase. Rodney made it to his pickup truck and jumped in just before slamming the door. The truck sped off into the night, its gray door glinting in the moonlight. Sylvia was taken aback by the turn of events. She wasn't afraid of anyone, but she felt uneasy at night, particularly in the kitchen. JN understood her concerns and took action. He installed motion-sensing alarms, updated the alarm system, and added security bolts to all doors and windows. This really reassured Sylvia, but she still had a lingering feeling of unease. A month passed, and although her anxiety had eased, it lingered in the back of her mind when she was at home. The sense of peace gradually calmed her, but it seemed that when she went out, her thoughts were Sylvia was feeling a bit unsettled, and it took her a while to feel calm again once she was back home. On Friday, she decided to visit a couple of elderly friends. She went into a bakery and bought a dozen donuts, an apple pie, and 3 cups of coffee. On her way to the car, she had a bit of trouble carrying everything, but she managed to open the door, put a box of donuts and a pie on the passenger seat, and 2 cups of coffee in the cup holders. She opened the back door, lowered the armrest to access the 3rd cup holder, and straightened up to get into the car. Rodney Wilson hadn't forgotten Sylvia. In fact, his obsession had increased after he saw her naked, emerging from the bathtub like Aphrodite emerging from the foam. Her image filled his mind, but his innate caution kept him from returning. He was terrified of dogs, so he wandered along the main street of the city, hoping to catch a glimpse of her. They saw each other less often than he'd hoped, since she'd become effectively a recluse. But he did see her with her husband at the grocery store and at the post office. He kept an eye on her, staying in the background and staying out of the way, but he couldn't stop thinking about her. He saw her at a petrol station when he was buying gas. She was driving her yellow Charger. He thought yellow must be her favorite color, and her car was yellow. She was wearing a yellow coat, and he thought she looked incredible. She was wearing a yellow coat, a little black dress, and heels. He jumped into his truck and followed her. She drove into a candy store, and he parked on the other side of the street watching her. She walked in. He watched as she put her shopping in her car. He parked nearby, admiring the curve of her yoga pants-clad ass as her top rode up. She straightened up, and he walked out, intending to walk past her into the store. Sylvia heard the sound of a car approaching behind her. She stood up. She got up and turned around. What she saw made her stop in her tracks for a moment. It was a blue truck with one gray door. She looked at the passenger and saw his face. It was etched in her memory, like it was in the kitchen window, haunting her mind. She felt terrified for a moment, but her anger quickly took over. It was the man who had invaded her privacy, making her feel unsafe in her own home and preventing her from feeling comfortable. She took 2 steps towards Rodney Wilson, landing a brutal blow to the liver. Sylvia was a strong woman, standing at almost 6 feet tall and weighing 140 lbs of thick muscle. She was an athlete who lifted weights 4 days a week and worked on her fighting skills by punching and kicking bags 3 days a week. She wanted to look good for her husband and had trained for it. Sylvia often sparred at the gym, training in kickboxing and mixed martial arts. She was in top shape, and she was ready for Rodney. She delivered a powerful left hook just below his diaphragm and above his stomach. It was a fierce blow, fueled by her explosive fury and rage. Sylvia threw a punch with all her might, hitting Rodney just below his ribs and going up to the base of his shoulder blade. Sylvia's fist sank deep into his soft body, and he was knocked unconscious with an explosion of air and excruciating pain. She followed up with a right hand to the same area. He fell to his knees, bending over in pain as he fell. His face was met with a powerful blow from Sylvia's right knee, breaking his nose and spattering blood on the asphalt. He lay there in a fog of pain and felt a new pain when he was grabbed by the hair. He was lifted up and saw the face of a goddess of vengeance before him, blurred by pain. "Remember me, bastard," she screamed in his face. "Come back to my house and I will finish you off and feed you to the dogs." Rodney tried to show that he understood perfectly. His head hit the asphalt, and he heard a car door slam. There was a roar of exhaust gases, and he heard a car speeding away. He fought through the agony, managing to crawl to his truck and climb inside. His nose was bleeding profusely, and he found paper towels to stop the bleeding. He managed to get home, where he lost consciousness. Both his eyes turned black, and his nose became crooked. His health wasn't the only thing he cared about. Alcohol and illegal substances fueled a rage that combined with his obsession, leaving him unable to rest. Fury mingled with memories of her. Naked glory obsession became a compulsion as his body healed. On the 5th night of John's absence, Sylvia made herself dinner, a delicious salad with fresh berries, and took it into the living room to curl up with a book. Niles and Grant were snoring on the floor next to her. She was totally absorbed in her book, the murder mystery, and the lack of evidence so far. She'd lit a fire in the fireplace and it was crackling happily. She was completely immersed in the story when she was suddenly brought out of her reverie by a shrill sound. When the security system went off, indicating that the back door had been broken into, she jumped to her feet, called Nil and Grant, and ran to her bedroom. She locked the door and, grabbing the shotgun, retreated to the bathroom, chambering around as she did so. She could hear Niles and Grant wandering around the bedroom, grumbling and looking displeased. She heard them enter the hallway through the broken back door. Rodney Wilson took the time to check the layout of the house as he walked through. The living room had a burning fireplace, which meant Sylvia was home. The eyes of the moose head above the fireplace sparkled with malice, and Rodney shivered under that gaze. The fire crackled angrily, making him flinch, and it seemed to him that the statue of Cupid at the foot of the stairs was aiming its arrow straight at Rodney's heart. His nerves were on a knife's edge. He walked through the house. Its open layout, he quickly realized that Sylvia must be behind one of the 3 closed doors or upstairs. He opened the closed door leading from the kitchen and saw a storeroom. He entered it, looking for something hidden. He thought Sylvia might be in the dark room. He heard a floor creaking ominously as he moved and walked past. There was a tall wine rack with dark bottles in every corner. Something moved, and the door slammed behind him. He turned and rushed towards the door, but he hit his shoulder on the counter. The bottle fell, breaking on the tiled floor and splattering wine on his feet and the floor. He slipped and crashed into the counter, falling to his knees. He looked up in helpless horror at the heavy counter laden with hundreds of bottles of liquid that leaned dangerously forward. He screamed hoarsely as the counter fell over, trapping him on the floor. 2 bottles of Cabernet broke and pierced his chest with their jagged necks, pinned down by the heavy stand. Blood gushed from his chest. Rodney struggled for a short time and fell silent. The house was filled with silence. The logs returned to their usual configuration. The fire crackled joyfully again, and the elk's gaze smiled benevolently in the empty room. When John returned the next morning, he saw the alarm was flashing, so he turned it off and went to look for his wife. The bedroom door was locked, and John had the keys and opened the door. Sylvia was sitting on the bed with her eyes closed, exhausted from the night's vigil. Niles and Grant Rose were on the floor on either side of the bed, rubbing themselves affectionately against his legs. He knelt down and hugged them, scratching them behind the ears and making them snore in ecstasy. After greeting his wife's furry companions, he went to find his wife. Guards, he walked over to the bed, sat down next to her, and pulled her into a tight embrace. She woke up from her sleep trying to pick up the shotgun, but he held her tightly. Whispering strong words of comfort and love into her ear, he asked, "Were you waiting to shoot me, kitten?" His gentle joke brought her to her senses, and she clung to him, sobbing in his embrace. John, it was terrible. She put the shotgun aside and fell into his arms. Someone broke in the alarm," she said. The alarm went off. "I was really scared." He kissed her tears away and told her everything was going to be okay. "I called the sheriff and he's on his way. We'll just wait until he arrives." They heard sirens in the distance and watched the house. The peaceful atmosphere gave them comfort and tranquility for a moment. He became more than just an observer. He became a participant and showed his abilities. He turned out to be quite strong. No one will ever again harm those under his protection.